On the first Tuesday of summer, Jarrell, Texas was just a quiet town of 400, its families easing into vacation and ordinary routines. But beneath the calm, a perfect storm brewed, one that would rewrite everything meteorologists believed about tornadoes. Scientists ignored the warning signs, record-breaking instability, but hardly any wind shear. That afternoon, the Jarrell F5 did the impossible, stalling for 3 relentless minutes, pulverizing Double Creek estates until nothing was left but bare earth. The story you're about to hear isn't about homes destroyed. It's about a day when nature's rules were broken, and why the phrase, "dead man walking," still haunts Jarrell. How does a peaceful Texas morning turn into ground zero for the most puzzling tornado in American history? Just off Interstate 35, Jarrell sits quietly on the edge of Texas Hill Country, surrounded by open fields, mesquite trees, and the steady hum of trucks rolling north toward Waco or south to Austin. On most maps, it's barely a dot. About 400 people, a handful of streets, and a scattering of neighborhoods built for families looking for space and peace away from the city. Double Creek Estates, a modest subdivision northwest of the Old Town Center, is carved out of former pasture land, with single-story homes and wide, grassy lots. Children ride bikes along gravel roads, dogs bark from behind chain-link fences, and neighbors wave from porch swings. The school year has just ended, so kids are home, filling the long hours with backyard games and TV reruns. Parents run errands in town or tend to chores, grocery runs, oil changes, a stop at the feed store. It's the kind of place where people know each other's names and keep spare keys with a neighbor. The Moorings are home with their boys, the Ruiz brothers in their trailer across the street, the Cantler family inside finishing lunch, and the LaFrances watching the sky from their living room window. At midday, the air is thick and still, heavy with the promise of summer. The only interruption is the distant sound of a lawnmower or the occasional pickup bouncing down County Road 305. For most in Jarrell, May 27th starts as another ordinary Tuesday, unremarkable but comfortable, the kind of day that feels safe, even as the horizon shimmers with heat. No one here expects anything more than a passing thunderstorm. Life, for a moment, continues just as it always has. The Ego family's house sits near the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, its yard dotted with bikes and a basketball goal. Inside, Joan Ego folds laundry while her youngest, Paul, sprawls on the living room floor with a comic book. Audrey, 17, lounges on the couch, half watching TV, half listening for the phone. John, 15, is in and out, restless with the new freedom of summer. Larry Ego, their dad, left early for work, but plans to come home in time for dinner. For the Igos, the day is stitched together by small routines, errands, chores, the low hum of family life. Across the street, the Moering family is gathered at home. Rodney and Cynthia Moering keep a watchful eye on their boys, Marcus and Mark, who bounce between the backyard and the kitchen, looking for snacks and the next distraction. The first week of summer break means no schedule, just the slow drift of daylight and the comfort of being together. Their neighbors, the Ruiz brothers, John and Michael, are in their trailer, windows open to catch the breeze. They chat about plans for the evening, maybe a drive or a trip into town, but for now, they're content to stay put. Down the block, the Cantler family finishes lunch. Jackie Cantler reminds her daughter, Rachel, to put away her dishes, while little John chases their dog around the dining room table. Mallory Cantler. Sumner, 8 years old, watches cartoons in her room, the sound of laughter and footsteps drifting from the hallway. The house feels safe, ordinary, just another day at the start of summer. In the LaFrance home, Debbie and her daughter Kristen keep an eye on the sky between chores. Kristen flips between channels, searching for something to watch, while her mom glances out the window at the thickening clouds. The air feels heavy, but there's no sense of hurry. With school out and no appointments to keep, their world is measured in small, familiar moments. For every family in Double Creek Estates, May 27th, begins with the promise of a long summer ahead. No one expects that, by evening, these routines and these homes will become the center of a story that will echo far beyond Jarrell. At 7 a.m. on May 27, 1997, the morning weather balloon launched from Fort Worth drifted upward through a sky that looked, on the surface, almost ordinary. But the numbers it brought back were anything but. Meteorologists stared at the data. Surface dew points above 73 degrees Fahrenheit, light winds, and a convective available potential energy. CAPE, reading that would break records for Texas. CAPE measures the fuel for thunderstorms, and on this day, the atmosphere over central Texas was loaded. The 1 p.m. special, sounding from Calvert, just east of Jarrell, clocked in at nearly 7,500 joules per kilogram. That's more than double what forecasters consider extreme. For context, most severe weather outbreaks in the plains run on CAPE values between 2,000 and 3,000. Here, the air was so unstable that any spark could ignite a vertical explosion. Yet, one critical ingredient was missing: wind shear. The upper-level winds, measured at just 25 to 30 knots, barely nudged the clouds along. Surface winds were from the south, but there was little turning or speed increase with height. Normally, this lack of shear would limit a storm's ability to rotate and organize. The textbooks say violent tornadoes need both high instability and strong veering winds aloft. On paper, May 27th looked like a day for garden-variety thunderstorms. Maybe some hail, possibly a brief tornado if a boundary could squeeze out a spin-up. The Storm Prediction Center's morning outlook reflected that thinking, highlighting hail and wind as the main threats. Few forecasters, if any, expected a setup for an F5, but the atmosphere had other plans. A cold front sagged south from Dallas-Fort Worth, intersecting with a decaying outflow boundary left behind by overnight storms. Meanwhile, a subtle gravity wave, an invisible ripple of pressure, slid southwest, nearly parallel to the front. Where these boundaries collided, air was forced upward with unusual efficiency. The surface map at midday showed a knot of convergence just northwest of Jarrell. Here, the energy pooled, waiting for a trigger. Meteorologists at the National Weather Service in Fort Worth watched the readings climb. The 3 CAPE, which focuses on energy in the lowest 3 kilometers of the atmosphere, also spiked, reaching 249, an almost unheard of value. This meant that not only was the air unstable, but the instability was concentrated near the ground, primed for rapid vertical motion if lifted. The ingredients were gathering, quietly, in a zone that straddled the border between routine and disaster. By early afternoon, the sky over central Texas was deceptively calm. Cumulus clouds drifted lazily, but soundings told a different story. The atmosphere was a powder keg, packed with energy, missing only a match. In weather offices, forecasters debated the odds. On radar screens, the first hints of updrafts began to flicker near Waco. The numbers were clear, but the outcome, what could happen when so much energy met so little wind, remained a question no one wanted to answer. Radar loops from that afternoon show a supercell behaving like nothing in the textbook. Instead of racing northeast, the storm creeps southwest, almost as if it's retracing its own steps. Meteorologists in Fort Worth and Austin watch the echoes drift against the usual grain, moving at barely 15 miles per hour. Chasers and spotters on the ground are caught off guard, some thinking the storm is stalling, others realizing it's actually backbuilding, growing new cells along the same boundary that started it all. Around 3:30 p.m., the tornado takes shape on the southern edge of the supercell. At first, it's a narrow rope, twisting out of the clouds and dipping toward open pasture. But as the minutes tick by, the tornado balloons outward, widening, darkening, splitting into multiple swirling fingers. Photographs snapped from a distance capture the moment it looks less like a classic funnel and more like something out of a nightmare. A wedge with legs, striding across the fields. Years later, this image will inspire the nickname Dead Man Walking, a moniker born not from meteorologists or survivors, but from those who see the storm's silhouette in that infamous photo. Two ghostly limbs marching toward Double Creek Estates. Local spotters radio in frantic updates. One describes the tornado as unlike anything I've ever seen. Another says, it's moving the wrong way. It's coming straight for town. On radar, the storm's motion defies every expectation. Instead of following the steering winds to the northeast, it lumbers southwest, locked onto a path that leads directly into the heart of the subdivision. The National Weather Service issues a tornado warning at 3:29 p.m., but the storm's slow speed and unusual track mean that, for some, the threat seems distant even as it closes in. Eyewitnesses recall the sky turning an unnatural shade, the air heavy and still, the tornado's base churning with smaller vortices, subvortices, spinning within the main funnel, each capable of its own devastation. These internal whirls carve separate scars into the ground, scouring the earth and amplifying the destruction. The wedge grows to nearly 3/4 of a mile wide, crawling ever closer, its motion giving residents precious minutes, but also lulling some into a false sense of security. Meteorologists tracking the storm realize the rules have changed. The combination of extreme instability, converging boundaries, and the gravity wave has created a monster that doesn't care about the usual playbook. The warnings go out, sirens wail, and the final moments of normalcy in Double Creek Estates begin to slip away. In the next few minutes, every decision, whether to run, to hunker down, to reach for loved ones, will carry consequences that no one could have predicted. At 3:29 p.m., the National Weather Service in Fort Worth issued a tornado warning for Jarrell. The warning went out over NOAA weather radio, local television and radio, and to county emergency officials with the message, a tornado is likely forming near Jarrell. Take immediate shelter. Within minutes, outdoor sirens activated in town, their wail cutting through the heavy afternoon air. In homes tuned to TV or radio, programming was interrupted by urgent voices and radar maps. Meteorologists used the words potentially violent tornado and stressed the need for immediate action. But for many, the language sounded familiar. Warnings like these had come and gone before, often amounting to little more than hail or a passing gust. The warning system in 1997 relied on a patchwork of channels. Some residents heard the sirens and rushed to interior rooms. Others received calls from neighbors or family, passing the message along by landline. In outlying homes beyond the reach of sirens, word of mouth and television coverage were the only lifelines. There were no cell phone alerts, no push notifications, no wireless emergency alerts to buzz in a pocket. For those outside, the sirens were impossible to ignore, but inside, with TVs off or radios silent, the first sign might be a neighbor pounding on the door, or a hurried phone call. Timing was everything. From the moment the warning was issued, the clock started ticking, a handful of minutes to make a choice. Some families gathered in hallways or bathrooms, grabbing blankets and flashlights. Others debated whether to wait for a parent to return home, or to seek shelter in a neighbor's house. On the roads, drivers who heard the warning on the radio faced a split-second decision. Keep going, turn back, or pull over and hope for the best. The warning system did its job, but its reach was uneven. In Double Creek Estates, every household received the message differently. For some, it came in time. For others, it would never be enough. Inside Double Creek Estates, choices narrowed as the sirens wailed and the sky darkened. Joan Ego, folding laundry just minutes earlier, called her husband Larry, both deciding to head home. Their 3 children, Audrey, John, and Paul, waited at the house, trusting that together they would be safer. Larry left work, Joan left her job, and by the time they reunited, the warning clock was already running down. In another home, the Mooring family gathered in their hallway, joined by the Ruiz brothers. John and Michael Ruiz knew their trailer offered no real protection, so they sprinted across the street to the Moorings brick house, following every piece of advice they had ever heard about tornado safety. They huddled in a bathroom, away from windows, believing the walls would hold. On the road, drivers caught between exits heard the warning on the radio and faced a split-second gamble: pull over and shelter under an overpass, or try to outrun the storm. Some parked beneath the concrete spans, hoping for safety, unaware that the wind could turn those spaces into wind tunnels. Maria Ruiz, watching the sky from her porch, debated whether to stay put or join her brothers. She chose to shelter at home, a decision that would save her life. In living rooms and kitchens, families clutched flashlights or family photos, pressing into closets, bathrooms, or hallways. For some, the urge to gather loved ones outweighed every warning. For others, instinct and circumstance forced them to shelter where they were. The warning had offered about 19 minutes, but in those final moments, time shrank to a handful of desperate decisions. The tornado's slow crawl gave just enough time for hope, and for many, no margin for error. When the Jarrell Tornado reached Double Creek Estates, it did not simply destroy homes. It erased them. In just under 3 minutes, the storm's core stalled over the subdivision, unleashing forces that defy ordinary explanation. Survey teams found entire houses swept clean from their foundations, with nothing left but bare slabs and twisted anchor bolts. In some cases, the steel anchors themselves, meant to hold walls down in the fiercest winds, were sheared off or ripped straight from the concrete. Plumbing pipes, set deep in the slab, snapped and vanished. Asphalt was peeled from roads in wide, curling sheets, leaving only raw, gouged earth. In the most heavily scoured spots, the ground was ripped open to a depth of 18 inches, exposing pale subsoil where grass and topsoil had been torn away. Trees that once lined the streets were left as stumps, their bark stripped and branches reduced to splinters. Vehicles vanished entirely or lay flattened, compressed to a fraction of their original height. Investigators documented cars hurled hundreds of yards, some never found, others embedded in fields or wrapped around tree trunks. Livestock disappeared or were found far from where fences once stood. Even the debris itself was pulverized. Rather than large, recognizable pieces, most evidence of homes and belongings was reduced to gravel-sized fragments scattered across the landscape. The physics behind this obliteration start with wind speeds estimated at over 260 miles per hour, but the real story is in the details left behind. Where walls once stood, only the faint outline of a floor plan remained, traced in dust and splintered tile. The force required to scour earth to such depth, or to peel asphalt from the roadbed, exceeds the design limits of nearly any structure. Engineers studying the aftermath noted that even well-anchored homes failed, not from poor construction alone, but from exposure to forces few thought possible. The Jarrell Tornado did not just test the boundaries of building codes. It revealed what happens when the atmosphere delivers its full, unrestrained power directly to the ground. In Double Creek Estates, the concept of shelter was redefined in the space of 3 minutes as the storm erased the familiar and left behind a forensic record of raw, unstoppable energy. Inside the LaFrance home, the world narrowed to a single room. Debbie, her husband Billy, and their teenage daughter Kristen crowded into the bathroom as the roar outside deepened. The walls shuddered. Glass exploded. Kristen remembers her father's voice, steady even as the air pressure dropped. "Hold on tight!" She grabbed Debbie's arm, squeezed her eyes shut, and waited for the sound to end. Seconds stretched. The floor vibrated as if the house itself was being peeled away. The wind was deafening, a freight train with no tracks, and then the ceiling vanished. Kristen felt herself lifted, weightless, spinning through a blur of dust and splinters. She landed hard in a muddy field, dazed, her ears ringing. All around, the world was unrecognizable. No walls, no roof, only fragments of what used to be home. Somewhere nearby, Debbie called her name. Both mother and daughter had survived, battered, but alive. Billy was gone. The bathroom, once a place of safety, had been reduced to bare concrete and broken pipes. Kristen's memory of those moments is jagged. The sting of grit in her mouth, the taste of blood, the way the sky looked too bright for what had just happened. She would later say that her father's words, "Hold on tight," became more than a command. They were a lifeline, something to cling to as she crawled through the debris, searching for her mother, trying to make sense of the silence that followed the storm. For Debbie and Kristen, survival came with wounds both visible and hidden. Their story became a touchstone for Jarrell, a reminder that even in the heart of destruction, instinct and love can sometimes tip the balance. In the weeks that followed, Kristen would repeat her father's last words to reporters, church groups, and classmates. Each time, the phrase gathered new meaning, echoing through a community learning to live with loss. The LaFrance family's ordeal was not just about holding on through the storm, but about holding on in the days and years that followed, when the sky was clear, but the absence remained. Emergency crews raced toward Double Creek Estates, expecting to find battered houses and scattered debris. Instead, paramedic commander Brian Wiseman and firefighter Kevin Krinke stepped out of their vehicles into a landscape so empty, they wondered if they had the wrong address. The neighborhood was gone. Just concrete slabs, twisted pipes, and a few splinters where homes had stood minutes before. Wiseman later recalled, "It looked like a field. We only realized we were in the right place when we saw foundation bolts sticking out of the ground." The first responders moved quickly, searching for any sign of life. But the usual cues, walls, roofs, even street signs, were missing. The tornado had erased not just structures, but the map itself. Crews called out names, listening for voices under the silence. Some survivors crawled from the mud, dazed and bloodied, but most of those caught in the core had no chance. The pattern was stark. People either walked away with minor injuries or were lost entirely. There were almost no moderate injuries, just a split between survival and absence. The shock rippled through every responder. Years of training could not prepare them for a scene where a whole neighborhood had been reduced to bare ground. As more crews arrived, the grim reality set in. This was not a search and rescue, but a search and recovery. The cost, measured in families and empty foundations, would haunt them long after the sirens faded. In the weeks after Jarrell, engineers and meteorologists descended on Double Creek Estates, searching for answers in a landscape stripped to its bones. Among them was Long T. Fan, a structural engineer from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who walked the bare slabs and examined the twisted remains of anchor bolts. Fan and his team questioned whether the tornado truly reached F5 intensity, suggesting that poor construction might explain why houses vanished so completely. Their report argued that some homes lacked proper anchoring, and that winds in the EF3 range could cause similar destruction if structures were weak enough. This critique did not go unchallenged. Meteorologists, including Dr. Adam Houston, pointed to the forensic evidence left behind. Ground scoured up to 18 inches deep, asphalt peeled from roads, and debris reduced to gravel. Trees were not just uprooted, they were debarked, splintered, and thrown hundreds of yards. These were hallmarks of the most violent tornadoes ever recorded. The debate over Jarrell's true wind speeds soon grew into something bigger, a push to rethink how tornado damage was rated nationwide. In 2007, the Enhanced Fujita Scale replaced the original system. The new scale factored in construction quality, a wider range of damage indicators, and more precise wind speed estimates. The lessons from Jarrell, its controversy, its scars, its unanswered questions, became the foundation for a smarter, more honest approach to measuring nature's worst. Even now, every time a tornado is rated, the ghost of Jarrell stands in the background, reminding scientists to stay humble and keep learning. On the north edge of Jarrell, a quiet grove of trees stands where the Ego family's home once sat. This is Jarrell Memorial Park, created not just for remembrance, but as a living promise that the 27 lost will never be reduced to numbers. Each tree in the park is planted for a name: Audrey, John, Paul, Larry, Joan, and every son, daughter, parent, and neighbor claimed in those 3 minutes. Over time, the trees have grown tall, roots gripping the same ground once swept bare. The memorial pavilion anchors the space, open to the sky, inviting neighbors and strangers alike to pause and read the names etched in stone. Families gather here every May, laying flowers, tracing the carved letters, telling stories that ripple through the generations. For survivors, the park is both a wound and a comfort. It's where Kristen LaFrance returns, sometimes alone, sometimes with her mother, to remember her father's words: hold on tight. Schoolchildren visit on field trips, learning not just about tornadoes, but about the people who called this place home. The park does not try to erase the pain, but it gives it shape: a circle of trees, a place to sit, a promise that what happened here will be carried forward in memory and in action. In Jarrell, the wind left scars, but the names in this grove endure, rooted in the earth, reaching upward. Every tornado leaves behind questions, but the answers from Jarrell are clear enough to save lives. Watch the boundaries. When a front or outflow line cuts across high heat and humidity, the risk can jump in minutes, even if the forecast looks routine. Never underestimate a storm that stalls. The Jarrell Tornado's 3-minute pause did more damage than its wind speed alone. If a tornado stops moving, the danger multiplies with every second overhead. Where you shelter matters. Bathrooms and closets help in weaker storms, but in violent tornadoes, only a purpose-built safe room or underground shelter gives real protection. Studies show that a safe room built to FEMA standards cuts your risk of dying by at least 90%, even when everything else is swept away. Mobile homes, even with anchors, offer almost no defense. If you live in one, plan now for a safer place to go. Redundancy saves seconds. Sirens, weather radios, phone alerts, and apps. Use them all. Don't wait for a second warning to act. Practice your plan with your family, so instinct takes over when every second counts. The lessons of Jarrell are written in both science and sorrow. Boundaries can betray. Stalling storms are killers. And the best shelter is one you build before the sky turns black. On May 27, 1997, the Jarrell tornado killed 27 people in less than 3 minutes, erasing Double Creek Estates from the map. The storm defied conventional science, moving southwest, stalling at peak strength, and producing the kind of ground scouring and structural obliteration rarely seen. Official records confirm most victims had little or no chance to survive, even when following recommended shelter protocols. Despite exhaustive surveys and the later development of the Enhanced Fujita Scale, meteorologists still debate the exact wind speeds and why the tornado lingered so long over one spot. Today, the population around Jarrell has grown tenfold, and warnings are faster and more precise. Yet the event remains a reminder that rare atmospheric setups can produce catastrophic results. The memorial park and 27 trees stand as evidence of lives lost and lessons learned. Jarrell proved that preparedness and vigilance are never optional when the extraordinary becomes reality.